Welcome to Life Science Leaders, a series of webinars and podcasts for leaders within the life science industry. Throughout the series, I will be interviewing senior leaders across the sector, covering topics that are relevant to what is happening in the industry right now, how that is affecting businesses, the market, and people. Today, I am speaking with Rick Leah, founder and MD of Callisto Life Science Partners. So welcome, Rick, and thank you for taking the time out to be part of this podcast series.
Thanks for inviting me, Claire. I'm happy and pleased to be here.
Perfect. So Rick, can you tell the audience a bit about yourself and who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, so I've been in the life science and medical device industry, I hate to say it, since the late 1980s. So a long history in sales, business development and marketing roles in both large multinational organizations and smaller startup companies. So what I do now is I really help startup and early stage companies commercialize their products for the first time, mainly in Europe, Scandinavia. So really just providing that additional insight and experience to help companies be successful and to plan a successful entry into the market.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Rick. So we should tell the audience, obviously, what the topic is that we'll be discussing today, and that is the importance of pre-commercialization planning in an evolving marketplace, and how do you make sure that you're well positioned. So there's going to be a hot topic right now, Rick, which I'm sure a lot of leaders are currently thinking about across all areas of the life science industry. So let me start by asking you, what are you seeing as the key challenges that companies are facing as they plan their commercialization strategies?
Well, I think there's several things, Claire, and I think there are some issues that have been ongoing for quite some time, and I think then also through various forces, there are new emerging issues as well. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is this much sort of broader stakeholder base when it comes to decision making for medical device or life science companies. Their customers are getting much more sophisticated. It's not just selling to the physician anymore. There's much more involvement from procurement and from other stakeholders, and they're applying different criteria to how they judge the value of a product. So it's not just about price anymore. It's about, you know, the longer term value. What does it cost to purchase, but also what's the downstream effect of that purchase? Does it incur more cost? Does it reduce cost? And, you know, they're employing increasingly sophisticated models to look at this. And I think companies, often small startup companies, are, you know, commonly ill prepared to deal with that, you know, to have the generated data and able to be able to support their value proposition. So that's something that I'm seeing a lot of. You know, there is a much higher burden of proof now in order to successfully penetrate the market and to drive adoption of technology. So that's ongoing. I think, you know, there's now, obviously, I think you had Paul Hercock on recently, and Paul was talking about MDR. So, you know, clearly there's regulatory challenges that are emerging, and again, a higher bar for companies there. So not only is it a question of getting your product approved or in market, but it's also a question of ongoing surveillance moving forward that creates a burden on companies also. So those are kind of the key things that I'm seeing. I think some of those have been ongoing trends. I think some of them have been accelerated by recent events, but you know, I think that's where companies really need to start looking and focusing. I think also the rep model is changing. You know, I think traditionally, particularly medical device companies, have gone to market with a kind of one channel approach, which is, you know, have a sophisticated sales team and that's all that you need. You know, the sales team is the vehicle that drives the product into the marketplace. And I think that's changing. That's been an ongoing issue for some time, with different providers looking at how they can drive these repless models and maybe cut the rep out of the process. But also, you know, there's aside from that, there's a kind of increasing need to have specialized salespeople, and providers and purchasers, payers are also looking at engaging with people who are not directly salespeople in that sense, but they're looking to engage with clinical liaison personnel as well. So they're looking for the medical input, not just a sales input. So I think that's really going to take hold, and it's going to become increasingly specialized. You'll have the salesperson, you may even have a support person that is a kind of case coverage person. And then also you need to have a really strong medical science liaison organization as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Rick. I mean, I come from industry myself, working for some big corporates, and it's pretty much the structure, you know, of what's happening in organizations now. So it's a valid point. Now, and again, you've touched on lightly there around the current situation, and the whole world is dealing with the pandemic. So
yeah,
today's market, obviously, and has COVID-19 changed the commercialization landscape? And if so, in what way?
Well, I think it's changed it fundamentally. I think, you know, for startup and early stage companies that are looking for funding, I think that they're probably finding that more difficult to source, because I think the current investors are looking at their portfolio companies and maybe looking at longer runways to profitability because of the various impacts that COVID-19 has had in terms of reduced procedural volume, etc. So I think they're looking to keep their powder dry and may not be looking to invest in new companies. And clearly, where there is a deficit in funding, that's going to affect commercialization plans and create either a true obstacle or at least a delay in reaching commercialization plans. I think also it's really changed how companies will go to market, because we're now in this kind of low touch environment where it's difficult for salespeople to access hospitals. There's policies and procedures in place that limit access. So, you know, this kind of one channel approach isn't going to be as effective anymore. And it's going to have to be a multi-channel approach where companies are engaging every channel that they can across social media, podcasts, you know, telecasts. All of these different media need to be engaged in order to engage with the decision makers. And I think the decision makers have also changed how they want to gather information. You know, I've seen some reports out that they are now sort of transitioning away from a reliance on the salesperson and are more willing to receive information remotely, electronically, via kind of webinars and those types of approaches. So I think it's going to have to be an adaptation of how this information is delivered to decision makers. So I think that was a trend that was happening, but I certainly think that COVID-19 has massively accelerated that. One of the things that I see in my discussions with clients is it's getting harder and harder to find distributors. So if your go-to-market plan includes an independent distributor channel, then COVID-19 has had an impact on those, because I think there's going to be some fatalities amongst the distribution channel. I think some distributor groups aren't going to make it because of reduced procedural volume and reduced income. So I think there may be a smaller pool of distributors to select from. And I think that, again, is going to have to be considered by companies as they go to market, is how accessible is it going to be to find this this channel to market and the salespeople that you need. So again, that's going to be a factor.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mean, you bring up the distribution side of things. It's something that I haven't been hearing a lot of myself, because obviously we don't, as a business, we don't kind of work so much with the distribution model side of things. But that's really interesting, and I wonder whether or not, you know, it's really that common knowledge in the industry at the moment. So you raise a valid point there, definitely. And I guess, Is it fair to say, Rick, that these changes affecting companies similarly across all sectors? For example, is it affecting biotech and pharma and medical devices all in the same way, or is there a variation there that you're finding?
I think there's a variation according to the sector. I think pharma and biotech have actually probably been historically more active in multi-channel approaches. You know, they've engaged direct-to-consumer advertising where that's applicable. You know, they've engaged social media much better than perhaps the medical device companies. And I think, you know, some of the medical device companies are starting to do that, but I think they're behind the biotech and particularly the pharma companies. So I think it's going to hit the medtech sector particularly hard, and they're going to have to play catch up to some of their industry peers in order to do this. And I think, you know, one of the big issues is going to be that smaller companies just don't have the bandwidth or the expertise to leverage those channels. You know, the larger multinational companies clearly have more expertise in those areas. They have more staff and personnel that can execute these strategies. And I think it's going to be difficult for smaller organizations not to be drowned out in the kind of the social media market. So that's going to take a little bit of thinking and a little bit of increased sophistication on their part as to how do they get their share of voice in what is going to become an extremely crowded and noisy social media marketplace.
Absolutely. And on top, I mean, you've mentioned obviously there that the devices side of things is going to be probably the most challenging side, on top of obviously what we were talking about with Paul, with MDR. They've got that to you know, to add to their list of things to do as well. So, you know, many challenges that you're seeing obviously around that side of things, which is really interesting. And I mean, given your experience in this field, what essential elements do many startups and other smaller companies often fail to address in their pre-launch planning, would you say?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that, you know, sometimes I think they look too far ahead and they're rushing to commercialize because they have a limited cash runway and they're being pressured by their board often to start generating revenue. And I think sometimes they often do that before they're ready. And I think they miss out some essential steps. You know, I've always used a pretty simple kind of plan, which is just breaking it up into 3 stages. And we talk about access. So who's going to pay for your product? How are they going to pay for it? How is it going to be coded? What's the mechanism by which you realize best value for your product in the marketplace? Secondly, advocacy. So who's going to speak up for you from a clinical point of view to the stakeholders? Who's going to be your product champion that will go out there and evangelize on your behalf? And I think, you know, it's clear that peer-to-peer selling or peer-to-peer influence is much more effective than sort of salesperson or corporate to end user influence. So you really need to get your advocacy sorted out. So that's finding good key opinion leaders, finding a good clinical advisory board that's willing to go out and promote the product ethically and responsibly and within all the guidelines, but, you know, that can take the data that you're generating and have a podium presence at the meetings hopefully when those physically start happening again, but certainly online. And, you know, I see that a lot of companies don't initiate that kind of advocacy, KOL engagement early enough. So they're not ingrained into the design and the product sort of offering. So they come almost as an afterthought, whereas engaging key opinion leaders and getting their clinical expertise and their perhaps their other expertise, their health economic expertise earlier is much more effective. And then the third phase that we always talk about is adoption. And this is the thinking about how are you going to take this product into the marketplace. And I think, you know, we now have to sort of almost tear up the playbook that we've been using for so many years and start again and say, you know, is a distribution channel option still available to me? Do I need to look at a direct sales option where I can hire a direct field sales force? And, you know, or is there other ways that I can do it? Can I partner? Can I license? So just, it was almost a given that companies, small companies, would go down the distributor route first. And then in the markets that were successful, they would then look potentially to take that direct as the market was more mature and revenue was being generated. But it's getting more and more difficult to find those good distribution partners now. So I think, you know, that can't be an assumption anymore. You've really got to build into your strategic plan a number of different scenarios. And that's another thing that I don't see startup and small companies doing particularly well, is that they have one go-to-market strategy that's based on a number of assumptions. And when one of those assumptions perhaps doesn't pan out according to their initial thinking, then they haven't done the scenario planning. They haven't done the what ifs.
Right. Okay.
So when something goes wrong, as it inevitably does in early stage and startup companies, there's always issues around funding or product development or regulatory, or you get a patent infringement lawsuit tossed over the fence at you. You know, what happens then is that then they're kicked off the track that they thought they were on, and now they have to scramble to kind of put a secondary plan in place. So, you know, my advice to any companies would be to, you know, do your scenario planning. You know, what if? How do you deal with the what ifs? And I think that is a key component of being successful, because with all the will in the world, the best laid strategies, you know, what do they say in the military? I think in the military, they says, you know, no strategic plan survives first contact.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true in the life science and medical device industries as well.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense to have that backup plan. And like you say, planning out, make sure that, you know, you do the whole what if, what's worst case scenario, and how do we address that? Absolutely. I mean, do you think a lot of the pressure though is really geared on, especially startups and small organizations that have investors? Is the pressure really all around that return on investment as quickly as you can get it? Is that really what hinders some companies, do you think, as well?
I think so. I think they, you know, get pushed into very aggressive early revenue targets, you know, because the investors are looking for a return. The investors are looking for validation of the technology. And so I think that they see revenue as technology validation. And so, you know, there's often very aggressive numbers put in there. And so, you know, they kind of rush towards that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they take their time. You know, companies often go from pre-launch phase to full launch phase directly. And, you know, my advice would always be to, you know, do some kind of soft launch, you know, beta test product in a limited number of markets and really hone in on it. Make sure that everything goes according to plan, that everything is taken care of, so that you deal with the what ifs and you deal with the questions surrounding the product early on before you are committed to spreading your resources too thinly across multiple markets. You know, take some time, take a deep breath, and just launch the product into a limited strategic marketplace, 2 or 3 markets at most. And then, you know, use that information to go back and reevaluate your plan, make some changes, pivot, and if necessary, and just validate the plan before kind of lurching forward and going full bore on the full plan. And, you know, I think you know, a lot of companies want to generate revenue early because they see this as the
Yeah.
driver, you know, behind a successful exit. You know, it's a multiplier of your revenue. But I think, you know, the more sophisticated acquirers of technology can look at a limited market launch, and if that's successful, then they can extrapolate the global potential from that and come to some kind of value of your technologies. So don't be in a rush to try and commercialize in 10, 15 different markets right out of the gate. It's often too challenging, and it spreads your resources too thinly to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, you probably touched on what my next question was really going to be. And I guess it's around, what is it that you feel that companies should be doing to address emissions and limitations in their planning? I mean, obviously you mentioned a few things there, but is there anything else?
Well, I think often companies become very enamored with their technologies, and they almost have this, you know, if we build it, customers will come mentality. And I think they often, you know, don't fully evaluate the limiters in the marketplace, the obstacles that they're going to encounter, and they almost have a kind of rose tinted view of the future. So I think they have to have people around them that are willing to, you know, call out the obstacles and the limiters that are there, and draw attention to them, you know, rather than sort of trying to skate over them to put forward a really sort of, you know, this kind of super enthusiastic business plan. So, you know, whether you do that through your board, and getting a good board of directors is key, whether you do that through hiring external consultants, which is obviously something that I do, and that's why I would partly why I would advocate it. But, you know, have somebody who's entirely objective, look at the business plan and look at the market and do the research independently, and come back and say, you know, this looks great, but I draw your attention to this potential issue. I draw your attention to this, you know, and have somebody pick holes in it. I think that's really key. You know, have somebody play devil's advocate and look at all of the worst case scenarios that could come out of it. And then, you know, once you're aware of what those issues are, then, you know, work through them and put solutions in place so that your scenario planning is then complete. I think, you know, it's almost that they're so pleased with their progress and their technology that they almost don't want to hear the negative sides of it as well. And I think that's probably natural in a kind of founder startup situation, but, you know, it's not always healthy, because if you don't, you know, if you don't look at those negative issues, and you end up getting blindsided, and that's, you know, that's catastrophic to a company, to get hit with something that they just simply didn't see coming.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, I think, you know, we speak to startups and SMEs all the time, and it's interesting because you're right, some of them do have rose tinted glasses on, Rick, and, you know, obviously it's not down to us as talent partners to ever kind of suggest that to an organization, definitely so. And I know, you know, these podcasts are not really about us, either us or our guests promoting their businesses, but I think you really raise a valid point in the respect of bringing someone that's, you know, independent, that doesn't have any connections, you know, so to speak, to that organization, that can give you a very, very candid, holistic approach, you know, a view of what's going on, what your strategy looks like, your go-to-market plan, and pick holes in it so that they're prepared and, you know, can actually sort of face obstacles that are coming up and know what they're dealing with when they're facing those. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of an ego scenario that might come into our industry, that, you know, people never want to be told that they're doing something wrong, or it's not going to work, or it's not right. So there's always that sort of resistance to it. But like I say, to be successful and to get a product to launch and to get that return on investment, it makes complete sense to obviously be looking at that and addressing different factors and bringing in the right people to do that for you, really. So I totally agree on that.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of perspective. Just get a different perspective, and wherever you go to get that, whether it's your board or whether it's mentors and peers in the industry, have somebody look at it with a critical eye and be honest. Encourage them to be candid about it, and then, as I say, I think a lot of these catastrophic incidents can be avoided because there's a lot of great technology that never makes it to market because there's been a there's been a misthinking somewhere along the line that's prevented what could have been a really successful organization from taking off. And in my 30-year career, I've been involved in a couple of those where we were all set to launch and then it just blew up on the launch pad, and it was a real shame because some of the technology was really promising. But that's one piece of advice is solicit critical thinking.
And it's invaluable advice, I would say, Rick. And I think again, there's some amazing academics out there that have products that they want to bring to market, and certainly not every academic doesn't have the commercial side of things. But sometimes I think it takes a stronger person to sort of say, I'm not qualified to do this, let me step away and get someone else that has a better eye for what we're trying to do here, and give us their views and opinions. And again, it's sort of, I guess it goes back to a little bit of the ego side sometimes for people, but
yeah. And I think it's often down to the fact that people have their specialisms. So somebody might be fantastic at product development and research, but not have the sort of the marketing capacity or the sales capacity, and vice versa. So solicit people that fill the gaps in your skill set and use them to really round out your personnel and the skill sets that you have in your organization. And don't be afraid to reach out to people that may have a different skill set than you or a different perspective.
Absolutely. And again, factoring in the current situation with COVID-19, we're constantly talking about it, but of course, how can we not? What is your outlook on the future of the life science sector if this is in fact to be the new normal?
Yeah, well, I think clearly, there's biotech companies that are actually doing well from the current situation, whether they are in sort of the diagnostic side of things with testing kits, etc., or whether it's in vaccine development. This is, in every crisis, there's opportunity. So I'm sure that the biotech companies and some of the pharma companies will be looking at some opportunities here. But I think for all of those who are sort of outside the immediate COVID-19 advantage, I think it's going to come down to those that adapt best. I think it's going to be Darwinism, and Darwinism was about survival of the species that is most able to adapt. So I think there will be opportunities here. I think that companies will find creative ways to exploit those opportunities, and those that do, I think, will be continue to be successful. I think there's going to be further consolidation in the industry. I think there's going to be acquisitions, and I think larger companies seem to be less speculative in their product development now. I think they look to de-risk a lot of the opportunities by acquiring in smaller companies that have at least proven the business model and the technology. So there seems to be less in-house development and more acquisition of third-party developed technologies. So I think that's going to create opportunities for startups to do some really favorable exits. So I think in any scenario, there's opportunity.
We live in the life science industry, there's acquisitions every day of the week, isn't there, that's going on, and then they're not happening, and so on and so on. But I think the two A's that you put out there, definitely acquisitions and agile. Agility is been something that people have had to rely on, or certainly get better at over the last few years. But even more so, I think, in the current climate, Rick, you're right in that, and companies do need to start really kind of thinking about that. And and addressing the current situation, and you know, obviously how they can survive in today's market, really, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that companies that have technologies that fit, you know, the scenario. So, you know, telemedicine companies, that's received a massive boost.
Huge.
Clearly, you know, whether how that plays out and is sustained over time, as hopefully we start to put this sort of COVID-19 pandemic behind us. You know, how much will this uptake of telemedicine
Yeah.
be retained, and how much will it fall back to the way that we used to do things? But you know, clearly it's created some, you know, significant opportunities. So I was reading one statistic that I think, you know, prior to COVID-19, 10% of GPs appointments were done via telemedicine and 90% were done face to face, and that, you know, during the height of this has absolutely flipped
It's on its head, isn't it?
around. So, you know, are we starting to fall back maybe to less of a 90-10 and more to a 80-20, 70-30? Then possibly. But I think certainly telemedicine has proven itself and will continue to be at a higher level than it was prior to COVID-19. And I think other, you know, technologies will be pulled along by that as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Paul and I was discussing that as well, particularly telemedicine, you know, because of the current situation, digital apps, everything, you know, that's kind of transitioning to a way where there's not that physical, you know, face-to-face or human contact at the moment. It's going to be a big upturn. And of course, the use of AI and different things like that, you know, it's changing the landscape, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it's not just sort of telemedicine from the point of view of sort of doing teleconsultations, so almost like this sort of talking to your GP. I think it's going to be all kinds of technologies around connected devices. You know, so there's going to be medical devices that have been used before, but never quite in such a connected way, where it's gathering data, it's collecting, you know, more information, it's allowing interaction, and it's allowing decisions to be made. I think there's going to be a massive opportunity around that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So more startups basically go into that side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've been kind of looking at the market, and there are some fantastically innovative new devices, connected devices
Yeah.
coming, which will, you know, really improve communication, but also, you know, there's always more demand for healthcare than can be supplied, and I think providers and payers are looking at much more efficient ways of doing things, and I think this, you know, this unfortunate issue that we've been dealing with a global pandemic has actually shown the value of that and proven out the model that you can deliver efficient care with no loss of clinical, um, you know, gold standard care, and also with no loss of patient satisfaction. In fact, in some cases, with increased patient satisfaction, because they find it more convenient, they find it less expensive, they find it less time consuming. So, you know, I think that is going to be a really powerful and robust opportunity moving forward.
Yeah, I would agree, especially, I mean, if I think about my parents' generation, you know, mum has got a smartphone and can just about navigate her way around that. So I think as the years go on, and obviously I feel that COVID has driven this, that, and of course as our generation grows older and, you know, we live with smartphones and everything else, it will become the new norm, I think, in a good 10, 20 years time, to be honest with you. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's only going to continue to be adopted as we move forward.
yeah, absolutely. So we've covered quite a bit today, Rick, but I guess just to wrap up, my final question to you would be, you know, what would your, and I did ask Paul this as well, what would your top tips be to summarize on this subject before we wrap up?
I think be critical of your own plan. You know, make sure that you do a really good landscaping project to look at all of the factors that can affect your commercial success, and, you know, be prepared to pivot. be prepared to deviate from your plan when required. Don't slavishly follow your plan because it happened to have been approved by the board, but go back and say, this needs to adapt because we have new information, because, everybody makes decisions based on the best available data at the time. And if new data becomes available and it changes your thinking on how to do something, then incorporate that data, make the change and move forward, even if it's in a new direction. So, some of the most successful companies now have done a complete pivot from what they started out doing, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. They're not the companies that they were. And that's because they've been prepared to adapt and change along the way. So keep your options open, keep your mind open, and solicit critical advice.
Yeah, perfect. And I think that's the perfect note to end on, really, Rick. Adapt, move, change with the times, and you can't go wrong. I think if you're a bit stagnant and you stay in the same place, then the world's just going to move way past you, and that's it, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's always going to be unpredictable circumstances. I don't think anybody predicted where we are today. But be prepared to gather all the data that you can about the situation, look at how it affects you, and be prepared to modify your plan accordingly and move forward.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we do need to wrap up now. So even though I could go on talking about this for ages, so I'd like to thank you, Rick, once again for joining me today and to sharing your thoughts with me and the audience, of course. I'm sure that the listeners will find it invaluable, definitely so. And of course, if any of our listeners do want to reach out to Rick to have a conversation or put on his expertise in terms of anything that you feel he could help you with, then please feel free to do so. The branding is obviously on this podcast. And I'm sure that Rick will obviously only be too happy to speak to you. And so that's it for today's podcast. Join me again for the next episode in the series, where I will have another guest on to talk about more relevant topics. So we hope that you found this beneficial, helpful and insightful, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you, Claire.
You're very welcome. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.